Hey everyone, this is Corey at BitBeamCannon, and with me as usual is Mike. Say hi, Mike.
Okay, how's it going?
We are a couple of professional pixel artists. We've been working in the industry and independently for many years, and we like to do these videos, this series, covering various titles that we believe are worth discussing from a pixel art perspective and getting into various aspects of why it's designed a certain way, why the visuals work or don't work. And the game we're highlighting in this video is a Super Nintendo title called Nightmare Busters. This game was developed for the Super Nintendo, as you can possibly tell. It was a very beautiful game we felt the need to highlight, but there is a good reason that when this was brought to my attention, I had never heard of it. And do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. Let me actually go to the Wikipedia page for it. And so this game has a really interesting history. As you can see here, it was created by a French development team called Arcade Zone, and this was back in 1995, was when it was supposed to be released by a Japanese publishing company called Nichibutsu, but the game was canceled due to financial issues, which is a real shame. It would have been cool if it got the exposure it deserved back in the day.
Definitely.
But yeah, so what's interesting is Arcade Zone resumed back in 2010, in the 2010s, I guess it says, after fans who played the beta cartridge called for an official release, and it was officially released finally in 2013 by Super Fighter Team.
Right.
Yeah, so definitely really interesting. And their website to this day does still exist. You could see it here, and at least they were. I don't know when or how frequently they produce new cartridges, but if after seeing this video or long plays or looking into this game more, if anyone wants to support the actual developers, you can contact them and see if they're still making cartridges of the game.
And the developers of this game, they apparently still wanted to make some money off what they had created, and they did make a 2004 mobile game, which this is on pre-smartphone days. You can see this old Java game here. They took the art and I guess converted it into a different sort of style of game to make a little platformer. It still looks pretty nice for a mobile game of the time, but obviously this wasn't the intention of the original developers, and I would say this was just a way to make some money back off of the production.
Yeah.
Came out at a time on these old phones where a lot of these Java games of the time, they kind of are obscure now. You can't hardly find any info on them or sometimes even footage of them because they were only released on certain models of phones. Those obviously are outdated and they never existed again unless you find some other way to get them. That's what this looks like. It's unfortunate, but we'll dive back into the Super Nintendo version.
I think a good way to get started on talking about the graphics to this game is just the very cohesive overall and quite unique look to the game itself. And it's clear they had really strong art direction. There was certainly a lead artist or art director who really had a very clear vision for what they were going for. And it really shows. There's not a single thing. I've not played the whole game through, but I've watched the long play, and everything fits so well. Nothing looks out of place at all. It all uses color and, in general, contrast and rendering style, all in a very cohesive way. And then obviously there's also the really interesting choice of making a game that's, for most of the rest of the world, so heavily themed on such a niche thing like a Leprechaun or Leprechauns. It's a two-player co-op game. So that's a really interesting decision to make, which may have also potentially hindered the ultimate marketing of this game. I'm not sure. But
I think so too. It could have also been the title. Back in the 90s, it was sort of the era of dark and gritty type stuff. So you had the term Nightmare, and you can imagine what a game would look like with the title of Nightmare. It's like a kid's nightmare.
Right, it's cartoony, it's brightly
it's
colored.
Cartoony, yeah.
Another thing I really like about the way they handled the visuals of this game, let me go into promotion here, is the fact that it uses what is largely considered a much more modern pixel art style, which isn't seen in that many classic 16-bit games. and you've got three major types of pixel art in regard to the way outlines are handled. And
Right.
the stuff that we really inherited from the old like 4-bit and 8-bit days was
Hmm.
every sprite having a stark black outline around everything. And you can see as I zoom in here, this is the opposite. There's no outline to the sprites at all. And then the
Right.
thing in between, which was extremely common from the Super Nintendo days onward, is where you would have the outline would be the darkest version of the particular color that it's outlining. So you'd have this dark, fleshy color, even though it's a bit too red, for the outline of the skin, and then for the outline of his purple sleeve, you'd have the darkest purple. Oops, and stuff like that. So that was an extremely common 16-bit sprite style. But this game uses the style that you see in a lot of modern pixel art games, where there's no outline at all. And you could really see it worked beautifully for this game. Not only does it free up that little bit of extra sort of real estate for the actual rendering of the character, you don't
Right.
have that pixel outline wasting space just on a black outline. So the detailing and rendering of the character goes all the way out to the absolute edges of the character. It just has a more, you could sort of say realistic or less sort of coloring book or cookie cutter sort of look to it. And
Yeah.
they really did a great job with this, and it was very easy to do on the Super Nintendo, where and I've mentioned this in other videos, the making the background graphics lower contrast, more muted, closer to monochromatic, or have large areas of monochromatic color. And that just
Right.
allows the character sprites and objects to just sort of pop and display so beautifully against the background. There's no chance. It's, remember what I call Confetti Syndrome, which happens on a lot of Mega Drive / Genesis games. You pause the game, and it's actually hard at a glance to see where the player character is and what's going on the screen. Whereas even if a lot of movement was going on, it's incredibly simple, it's incredibly easy to see exactly where everything is and exactly what everything is on the screen, which was beautifully done.
Yeah, certainly.
And one of the reasons that it was so easy to do on the Super Nintendo was you were getting into that era of 16-bit consoles. The Super Nintendo was really heading into the first really arcade quality graphics. Okay.
Yeah, this game, when you see it in motion with its visual design and everything, I mean, it really is like you could easily see this in an arcade cabinet, standing right there next to the greats of that era. And they were going for that quality. I believe the timing of this game, 1995, that was around the time everybody was going to CD drives and PlayStation and things like that. It makes me wonder if the cancellation was due to partly to that,
Right.
which is unfortunate. But it does seem to me like this game could have competed during that time. Like this character design, the main character. It's a perfect example of things we've talked about before, where iconically you're emphasizing the things that matter the most in the character. Like he's not taking up a lot of space. He's a little guy, but you see that hat and the ear, all of the features that give him exactly there's no question that's a leprechaun. Very iconic. And they even tied that into his sort of icon at the top, which is like the player icon. I believe this is a 2-player game, right?
Yep,
It can be.
sure is. Yep.
So you have just the hat icon. They could have tried to cram, his face or something in that tiny space, but it wouldn't have worked that well.
Yeah.
They knew taking that hat was probably the best way to go. And it's kind of genius, Yeah, you see how that looks. It almost looks like a chef or something, being garbled like that. So
Yep.
impressive decision, yet very simple,
Yeah, that's a really fascinating topic all unto its own, this idea, and it's so critically important for video game artists because it's all about the visual communication. At a glance, the player has to know exactly what's going on and what's being represented. What represents your player, what is good, what is bad, what is things you can actually land on or interact with. And this goes into that overall topic called iconography. Like, this is one of the best examples that I've ever seen with this particular game, where the player is a leprechaun. There's that quintessential relative size to the character in the saturation, how bright the color is. Everything that screams leprechaun about this character is put to full use. It's vividly colored, very brightly contrasted, and they make up large parts of the character, like the, you know, the leprechaun-y kind of pointed, nosy, muzzly face, the ear, the top hat especially is, you know, if you divide the character into thirds, the top hat is the first third of the entire height of the character. The bottom third are the very quintessentially like old-fashioned buckled boots.
Right.
So it's an extremely iconic character where a giant amount of the pixels used are screaming the theme of the character at you, making it extremely clear what the character is. And then, so that was a brilliant idea. In almost every game you'll ever see where they're representing the player, they've either got a very generic P1, like actual text, or they've got the face of the player, which only makes sense. And it was just such a great idea for them, you know, and I'll bet you there's a very high likelihood they did try to get the face in there. That's the instinctual thought, is to try to do that, to get the whole head of the character. So the major options they had before they came up with the brilliant idea of just using the hat is to try to use the whole face, including the hat, which just everything gets so small, you can't really appreciate any of it, and it becomes harder to really tell, oh, that's a leprechaun hat, or that's a head at all. And then the other option would have been to zoom in on only the face, which then you would have completely lost the charm and the iconic leprechaun hat that lets you know that character's a leprechaun.
Right. And also, just talking about his design in general, the sprite design, they did a really good job of making a small character. And he's not just small because he's a leprechaun, but, you know, fairly low res on screen and everything. Emphasizing all of the things that matter, yet he still has enough, I would say, bodily mass with his arms and things like that, where he can still strike very impressive poses and move around in ways that are meaningful and important for what he's doing. So everything is clearly communicated with everything he does. That's
definitely one of the big things about the overall visual style of this game. The artists used the colors extremely well, the contrast to separate things really well, yet to make these cohesive things. You look at this screenshot, extremely cohesive HUD that has no problem standing out against the background, extremely cohesive character that just stands out beautifully from the background. Same thing with the player character. They all just separate so well. And that's a thing I meant to mention before, is one of the reasons they were able to do this is the Super Nintendo has a lot of 16 color palette sets that the artists can choose from for any given thing. So they could make sure that they separated, the background was using its own sets of 16 color segments of the overall 256 color palette. It was even easier for those artists, as opposed to if they were working on something like the Mega Drive. They've got more color real estate to work with.
You can see that clearly there with see those muted trees back there, exactly. A little bit of that landscape. It's like it's just enough to give you the feeling that it's there, like you see it, but you're not focusing on it. It's kind of back there.
It helps push it back into the background, helps the characters stand out, and everything you can interact with gives it a much better sense of depth. And you can also do cool palette changing. Is just a great tool you can use on retro computers and consoles. It's virtually free for performance and for memory, and you can have these really cool entire screen effects, like when you're using a magical attack or anything like that. And you could see here, because they were able to separate everything and make all the major things like backgrounds and specific characters use their own palettes, then you have the ability to palette fade or instantaneously change palettes of specific things, like in this case the background, to get these really cool effects. Which obviously that would not be possible if you had, like on the Mega Drive, I think there's just 4 16 color palettes, and pretty much anything can use any of those 4 16 color palettes. But then 4 16 color palettes isn't a huge amount of individual palettes to work with. So the odds are you'll end up having to use the same palette that's used in the background or foreground graphics will be used for some of the sprites. And then now you're stuck if you do a palette change on the background. Now some of your sprites are going to be affected too. So
Right.
it's way easier to do cool things like that and get really good use of it on the Super Nintendo. I love these colors that are they're nice and vivid with nice contrast, but they're also not primary colors. That's another benefit to the Super Nintendo, is a really high color fidelity. Do you remember how many thousands of colors the Super Nintendo has?
It's 5 bits per channel, so it's 15-bit color, which is quite a lot. It gets massively high into the thousands.
Yeah. I know it's many tens of thousands, but I can't remember off the top of my head. Maybe we can edit that number on the screen.
Yeah, I'd have to do the math again. I can't remember either. But it's so much that for a low, the resolution it is, you pretty much can do whatever colors you want. And the nice thing about the Super Nintendo having those extra bits per channel, as opposed to something like the Mega Drive or sometimes even the Amiga, like, you get into those really dark tones, and you can't do that as much with lower color fidelity. But the Super Nintendo excels at that, and this is a game that takes full advantage of that. With the background design and all those nice dark tones. They still have a lot of detail going on back there, but it's very subtle in terms of its shading, and it works very nicely. So. Yeah, and this forest level, there are many levels in this game, but this is one shining example of the level of contrast being used very appropriately in the environment.
Yeah.
You have this grass, which looks almost moss-like, in this forest, and it's kind of got that really lit edge, so you can see everything you can stand on, but everything is pushed back to the back, and it's not just because it's dark, but also because they cleverly made sure anything that you couldn't interact with was obvious. It's pushed back there, and then you get into some nice things like this totem. Just every piece of art in this game is so visually appealing that it's like you could, as a pixel artist, study it for a very long time. I've noticed it looking at it myself. Yeah, the amount, a completely monochromatic totem there, which even mirrored, as we had mentioned before, yet they still were able to make it look incredibly interesting.
So beautifully
when they
designed,
didn't even have to, and wouldn't have bothered in many other games, right?
Yeah, it's just that you can tell the artists really were very creative people having a lot of fun. They understood, and I have no idea how many artists were on this team. It's so cohesive. It could have been done by one person, but that's very rare for a full-blown 16-bit game and onward with this much art to be done by just one artist. But it's just that totem. It had so much theoretically going against it in that it's a very mundane, not very relevant part of the game. So a lot of artists would have not bothered putting that much work into its design. It has to be made by being just half of it and then horizontally flipped and stamped down to finish the other half of the face. And again, that forced symmetry would also usually be a big hit in the potential visual quality, and the way that forces the lighting to be perfectly from sort of the front. All of these things are theoretically going against it, but the artist or artists that made that did such an amazing job with not only the design, but the actual rendering, that it is just one of the most beautiful bits of pixel art from the 16-bit era. Like, I just love that, especially the face, obviously, on the totem. It's so quintessential for this game. It might as well be the icon for the game itself. It is... Like, it's got that leprechaun-y style nose. It's nightmarish and it's evil, kind of malicious grin. It's just beautiful work. But anyway, totally agree with what you were saying about the backgrounds. The use of, I loved how in the background here, when you really had the back playfield very visible during this boss fight, the way they muted everything down in the background and played with those, like the opposite of on the color spectrum, You've like purple is nearly on the opposite side of the spectrum as greens and turquoise, and so you get this, and then obviously cooler colors go to the naturally go back in the distance, sort of psychologically and visually, and and the lower contrast, of course. So you've just got this incredibly nice atmospheric back layer that really helps. And like you said, there's no mistaking what part of the foreground you're going to be landing on. It's just really beautifully done.
Right, even with all of the detail it has.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's what leads into that confetti syndrome is like you want to put in the detail, but you're not paying complete attention to the tones you're using. And I think that's the big difference here is that there's lots of detail here all over the screen, but they knew what to emphasize and what not to, what needed to be pushed back or just not as relevant. You know?
That's such a great lesson. I think we touched on this in other forensic Pixology videos, but that's one of the most important things you need to learn as a pixel artist for a game. You're not just working on each one individual image or even animation. You constantly have to be thinking of the entire game and how what you're working on, how it works and relates to the whole finished game screen, with all the motion, with the layers, with the background, with the characters, with the enemies. Everything has to not only look, it's not good enough that it just looks good on its own. A lot of beginner artists that are very passionate and talented, they don't have that experience yet, and they really want to show off how much awesome detail and contrast they can get on everything. And then the problem is you end up with like a hyper confetti syndrome, where just you put they finish each piece of graphic, and they all look great on their own on the screen in like ProMotion or Photoshop or whatever graphics program they used. Then you get it all together, and everything is fighting equally for your attention. Everything is overly contrasty, overly detailed, or at least the things that should not be overly contrasted, they are. And then that's how you end up with a screen where everything is like here, you know exactly what's relevant, you know where you can land, you know what's an important item that you can grab. There are explosions, which they're bright and stuff, and they are relevant for gameplay, but they also disappear very quickly. You know what I mean? So
yes, they did great with having lots of effects, yet they're not overwhelming or too distracting from the characters. Like you want to see the enemies coming in, you want to see every threat to you, which wouldn't be the effects, right?
Right.
But they're not hiding any of that. They appear as quick as they need to. They're very nicely done, but they're not. They're not obstructing anything. That's important visually.
I also just noticed the majority of them I was seeing a minute ago, like those smoke and the explosions, it looks like they're flickering them on and off every other frame to also create the illusion that they're semi-transparent, which is also going to make them less relevant while you're playing the game visually than the completely opaque things that are on screen much longer. The other interesting thing about almost every effect in this game uses a much more modern style of kind of like particle effect programming, where most of the older, especially 8 but also 16-bit, like an explosion was just a canned animation that the artist made that fit within 32 pixels wide or whatever, and it just played its animation and disappeared. But you'll notice in this game, almost every effect that appears, it moves on its own programmatically in a direction. Like those explosions, it just generates like pieces of the explosion that all go flying in different directions. That's not built into the animation by the artist. It's programmatically the pieces, the individual sprites that make the whole explosion effect are being sort of controlled and moved around on their own.
Yeah, it's a good example of two different skill sets coming together and cooperating very well. Like it was well planned. Like a lot of love and attention went into this from all aspects, not just the art. So it's an amazing feast of the eyes, so to speak. It seems easy to make a forest very interesting. Maybe not easy, but like there's a lot more to work with there in terms of the depth and color. This is an example, though, this interior of this ship of a very monochromatic wooden environment. Everything's made of wood. You can see it, yet they they did a great job of breaking it up and making it look incredibly interesting. There are plenty of times you've played games where it's like, oh, this is the inside of a ship or a
Hmm.
shack or what have you. Everything's made of wood and it's very mundane. But they didn't do that here. Like they had the nice curvature in the background.
Yeah.
Every element of it has some form of interest or is a different tone of wood, different type of wood. It's interesting. A great example of how you can take something that might have sounded mundane to the artist when it was told, hey, we're doing the inside of this ship,
Yeah.
and they know what they're thinking right off the bat, but they tied it into the world and sort of the fantastical nature of it, and really brought to life as many details as possible to still tie it in visually with everything else, even though they did have to do like, okay, we're doing this very wooden place.
Yeah,
So
and it's one of those things. You always have to think when you're a visual artist or almost any kind of artist, when you're given the sort of palette of things you can use, you always have to figure out what contrasts and what contrast do I have to work with where I can make this interesting. And if everything has to be wood, you still have contrast of just overall scale of texture and of color, like what color hues work within this whole idea of wood. And again, like this is so important if you're going, especially if you're doing the environment art, this idea of breaking it up into large areas. And again, like this helps the important things and the characters pop and show so well on the screen. You could see it's broken up almost into thirds. You've got the top, which is very vertical lines and dark. And then this first big horizontal line really breaks up this whole area that is largely horizontal. And you've got these reddish wood colors just accented with a few more muted colors. So again, it's largely monochromatic areas with just a little bit of a sort of secondary color that's near it on the color wheel, so to speak, to give it
yep.
this little bit of accent without it being too contrasty and too loud, without these things showing up too much. And then you go again, you get this bottom third of the screen that gets into the more yellow, warmer tones. You're starting to get into the foreground, so it's getting brighter lit with stronger contrast. And you've just all these things. You've got the artist is dividing it into vertical sections and largely horizontal sections, which obviously this bottom part is extremely horizontal. And then there's also the how warm or cool is it, how sharp overall the contrast is. Those are the sorts of things, the sort of idea of grouping. So in any one of these groupings, the player character and enemies and pickup items and all that, they'll just show up so nicely, and none of the background is fighting for your attention. Imagine if it was one of the less experienced artists that said, oh, how many colors do I have to work with? And they just
Right.
used all these colors all over the place, all over the background because
and
they
you
could.
get sort of a rainbow. You're gonna have every color you can think of back there.
Yeah.
I've seen that plenty of times, and
Yeah.
it gets overwhelming,
Yeah.
to look at. But they were intelligent with not doing that
Yeah.
in this game for sure. But,
Another fantastic example of this color grouping is this castle that we discussed briefly before recording this video. But I really want to get to a specific section. Right here it comes here. Let me pause the screen. And this is a really fascinating example of what's going on in the minds of the artists that are working on these environments. They know they want to separate foreground from background to really give you interest, but also really help it's a video game. It's not just an image you look at once. It's going to be a
Right.
movement. It's critically important to the player. They immediately know what's important and what's not. They want that sense of that illusion of depth and distance. So you could see they pushed that background really far back and tinted it green, so it's more interesting than if the whole thing. It would be so easy to fall into a trap that we've seen so many games and pixel artists fall into, where it's like, oh, a castle, okay, everything's stone, everything's gray,
Right,
and you've
right.
got the same sort of texture and the same hues everywhere. But they really took the opposite to a beautiful extreme in this game and in this environment, especially where you can see this is supposed to be the same stone wall face right here. And the artists very, very cleverly let you know this is due to lighting, that there's a lighting issue that is tinting the background, that's making it dark and making it tinted green. And you could see over here, this is what I love about this, it's so clever. Remember, in the 16-bit days, things were broken into which palette group it could use. It was, back in the 8-bit Nintendo days, it was little groups of 4 colors. In the 16-bit days, it tended to be more, usually 16, sometimes 8 color groupings. And so you could see here, I guarantee the seam between the tiles is right here vertically. So the background graphic artist used this palette to transition into black, or almost black right here, and then used these tiles with a different palette, but also transitioned to black, so that you'd have this invisible seam broken up by lighting, or the illusion of lighting, that's going to let your brain know that this is the same stone surface that's just being affected by lighting as it transitions into this darker green palette. And it's just one of those ways, like, instead of this artist going, oh, well, I have to do a castle, and not sort of rising to the challenge to figure out how to make it interesting. Let's see if we could find a really good segment.
Yeah, there are some great parts of the castle which show a lot of that. Yeah, like this sort of stuff with the pillar and the design of the floor there, like the extra care taken even with that. I mean, it's so easy to just make a simple plane, you know, out of stone or what have you, or brick, and to fall into that everything's the same size and shade brick mentality of just brick-tastic. You know, you see it a lot of times with city designs in old games, you know, but a lot of times in castles too. But they didn't do that. Yeah, there's plenty of that going on in the very back, but they broke it up with larger bricks. Right. And then the foreground stuff is totally different. It's a totally different scale and lighting and everything. And it's masterfully done for something that could have been very mundane. Right. Had they maybe had to rush it or not had the time or the budget or what have you, you know.
And so again, when your so-called palette is limited, and I don't mean necessarily just how many colors you have to choose from. I mean things you have at your disposal, things you can contrast. When that's limited, it's the artist's job to rise to the challenge and say, okay, well, what can be different in these things? If everything has to be stone, how many different types of stone with different hues and different texture and different contrast and different scale, as Corey mentioned? You have this overall repeating standard brick, like offset pattern in the background. But then they broke that up with some bricks being much more in shadow, some bricks being drastically larger, and then this very organic sculpture that they put into the wall, which is it's awesome. It looks like it's a hole for bats, like it's a bat nest or something. But then there's the other thing, again, how I pointed out vertical sections versus horizontal. So a general brick pattern is going to have a pretty strong horizontal sense to it, but then you've got this very vertical column where the artists were very careful to make sure that they're not breaking it up into lots of small horizontal sections, because you already have that in the background, right? So now we're going to go with the vertical, very vertical delineated segment for the foreground column, and then you have this offset standard brick laying pattern here for the background. So the floor, even though it's also stone, it's large tiles that are in a grid pattern instead of an offset brick pattern. And then you've got this really nice accenting along the edge, which has very organic sculpting in there. And that's a sort of thing where a lot of artists, even very good artists, they're not going to think about and be creative with those sorts of things to really add all this richness and these contrasts that aren't overly contrasty. It's there. It makes the whole thing look more interesting without fighting for your attention. You're never going to be distracted by this while you're playing and go, oh crap, I thought that was an enemy, or I thought, you know what I mean? It's like,
some artists would have, like that little organic design there on the edge of the floor. Some artists would have had had way too much fun doing that all over the place, and
Exactly.
it would have looked like, wow, that's overwhelmingly weird,
Right.
but this one was like, okay, I'm going to use it down here on this edge, so it emphasizes the edge of the floor, and that's
Right.
all it needs to do, and then everything else is going to have its own flavor as
Right.
far as the way it looks, and it was very excellently done.
Yeah.
Now I do know that this game, since it was canceled, it makes me wonder how much of it was made when it was canceled and how much
Yeah.
they finished
After
after
the
the
fact,
fact,
yeah.
like years later. It would be interesting to know that. If anybody does know, let us know. We're curious about this game as well. But
Yeah. Oh, and yeah, just speaking about, yeah, what you were saying earlier made me think about that whole concept of less is more, how artists would be tempted to add this kind of like organic sculptural detail everywhere. Like
right,
that's
yeah.
like seasoning. It's like, if you have some strong seasoning like garlic or whatever, and ooh, a little bit of garlic gives it this nice little accent and punch. And then, like, someone might just go, okay, garlic equals good, therefore the more
Right.
garlic, the better. And then eventually you've got something that tastes like nothing but garlic. So,
You have garlic with a little pasta on the side.
yeah, exactly. So so it's critically important to understand that something loses its value when there's nothing but it. I think there was
Right.
even a joke of that, this idea of how mundane it would be. Like, you might love donuts, but if it rained donuts, I think there was a Simpsons episode where
Right.
he was like in a time travel device and he kept altering history in the future. And anyway, one of the worlds he ended up with, it like rained donuts, and he was super happy. But again, like if you're constantly drowning in this thing, no matter how cool it seemed when it was rare, you're going to get really bored and eventually sick of that thing.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? But anyway, and it's very much that case visually. You should always shoot for good quality, good rendering style, but it is that contrast. It's hitting the splash of the unique. Its uniqueness is part of what gives it the value. So if we look at this, they only have so much memory and so many tiles to use. And here's this column that most of the segments are identical. And then right here, they used their memory wisely, used a few more tiles to add this beautiful crack that breaks up that verticality in this little segment where the facade of the column is broken off. That adds so much more realism and interest. But imagine if every segment had the same exact break in it.
Exactly.
Like those are the
Yep.
critical things that another one of the critical things that a pixel artist needs to keep in mind. Right.
Yeah, and tying into that visual communication and how it gets into gameplay, you can see here this sort of background platform that he can jump on, right? And it's got just enough color, just enough brightness, right, sticking out there to let you know, hey, you can stand on this thing.
It's all about establishing visually. When you're making a game, it's not just about making it look good and even communicating as well as you can in the moment. Sometimes a video game is like a visual journey for the player, and you need to establish these ideas in their head, this way you're communicating with them visually. It's going back to this idea of iconography. You're teaching the player almost a visual language. So you could see right here in this part of the level, the beginning of the level, before it gets deadly dangerous,
Right.
they establish for you the same design, even though this is a little darker. There's this aesthetic. It's the same color palette. It's the same like little lipped edge, the same overall texture. And it's letting you know you can't proceed in this game. It's obvious those spikes are deadly or at least going to hurt you. The only way you can go is up. So it teaches you that this, that looks like this, is something you can interact with. And the first time you jump up, in order to get on there, you're forced to grab the ledge of it and hang and then go up.
Exactly.
So
Yep.
this is all training you visually. It's tying in the gameplay with the chronological visual experience to the player. You're communicating, you're teaching the player, you're setting things up so that when the time comes and their video game character's life depends on it, they know what is being communicated to them visually. Anyway, I'll let that.
Right. Yeah, these instances we've talked about it with level design, but it's not always just up to the level designer. They have to work with the artist. The artist has to keep those things in mind as well. And you see how it gets into it here. Now it gets more challenging. The things are popping in and out of the wall based on their lighting, you know. And they do get a little dark, I think, when they go all the way back, maybe a bit too much, but it's enough to let you know, hey, you can't grab it at that time.
Exactly.
You know?
That's the critical thing. You don't want the player jumping for it when it's going to not be grabbable at all.
Right.
So I agree with you. It's so dark, it blends in with the wall so much. If you're not paying attention to the movement or waiting a second to see does the platform come out there, you might not notice. So they had to play that line, what's more important? They had to make that judgment call. Is it more important to really let them know there's definitely no way you're going to grab this? It's just as low contrast as the rest of the bricks. You know what I mean? And I agree.
I think a quick fix for that could just be some quick design on it that makes it not look like the rest of the bricks. But that's pretty minor criticism.
Yeah, we discussed that before recording the video. Yeah. What both of us would have been tempted to do is give these specific things something more like an actual railing or bar that the character can actually grab to make it really obvious that that particular gameplay mechanic is supported there, as opposed to a rounded stone edge, which would be incredibly difficult to grab with one hand without slipping and falling into the spikes. So it would do two things. It's one, more realistic psychologically, but two, it's a much more clear communicator. This type of gameplay is supported by this thing, and you see that in most games, going back to Bionic Commando in the arcade or 8-bit Nintendo, and then all of the great games that had the grappling hook mechanic. Most of the time, you had, like in the Super Castlevania and Metroid, or maybe not so much Metroid, but very specific tiles or sprites that you could link the grappling hook onto.
Right. And they stood out quite well. Yeah. This was a case of I think they didn't go too unique with it because it's not heavily used throughout the game. It's sort of like it was that one little section they wanted to do, and it gets a little crazier. If you go forward in the video a little bit, they do a section, since they've taught you this, and I think we saw a glimpse of it before, but it gets into this mode of like, oh, now you've got to get on this thing and jump up and down. And interesting, this looks incredibly challenging, actually, but
this whole game is tough.
It's from what I've heard, but it looks. You know, they've taught you all of those mechanics, and then it gets into the real challenge of this section, which is, you know, it does get into that game design discussion, but it's also like, hey, even though that thing isn't the same color as those ledges before, it's about the same size, right? So they taught you anything this size that has this sort of shape to it and this level of contrast. That's what you can hang on. And their hope is, at that point, the player, once the platform rises up just enough, the first time that happens, they will instinctively drop to the bottom once they've learned the mechanic. Of course, this is fairly late in the game. I believe the player would have mastered that to some degree at this point. I would like to think so.
Yeah, and they do. Look at this. The level design, let's get back to it. Sorry, I went back too far. It's a little hard with the long play. There we go. The spikes are higher at first to give the player just another split second of additional time to figure it out the first time, and then they drop lower. So now you have less time to do your up and down juggling to make it through this challenge.
And it's worth pointing out, even though we've gotten into the vast majority of this game being what I would say a visual masterpiece, if you get into these special effects with the big moves, which the player in this playthrough doesn't use that much, but they use it here, and you could see based on that footage there, it's very heavy, screen flashing. You know, warning for anyone who actually wants to try to play this game. That is the case, unfortunately, which was pretty common back in the day, but you know, people have since learned their lesson on that sort of stuff. The effects by themselves would have worked just fine here, I think, if without the heavy flashing. If you are going to do tinting or palette flashing like that, you want to keep it a little more subdued.
For the sake of people with epilepsy or something like that, you also don't want to strobe it so intensely and so rhythmically.
Yes,
So,
exactly.
make it appear and then fade back out, something like that, that's fine. But when you're pulsing it,
Right.
it's just something they would never do anymore, because you're going to end up hurting people with, with conditions that make them susceptible to harm from being exposed to such flashy things.
Right,
But
and
yeah,
this
yeah,
it takes us right to this moment too, where you get to the outside of the ship, and even though it is a nice reveal that
yeah,
you're not in a ocean sailing ship, you're actually flying through the sky. You can see here all the massive detail put into this otherwise beautiful background that
yeah,
is scrolling way, way, way too fast.
yeah,
It's a bit intense. I think this is a good example of possibly miscommunication. Maybe the artist was told, "Hey, make this night scene," and obviously with the talent they have, they made something very beautiful. And then maybe the programmer or level designer was like, "Hey, this has got to scroll super fast for whatever
for
reason."
drama. Yeah,
Yeah, for drama,
yeah,
and it's a bit of a clash. It's
right.
a lot going on back there visually for it to move
Yeah, I
that
agree completely. I
so.
really get the feeling that the artist was not assuming or anticipating that the art would be used in this way. Because,
Yeah,
I mean, it's one thing, like most of the game, everything is relatively muted and monochromatic. So if it were just the clouds, I could almost believe that the artist knew that the background was going to be scrolled so quickly. But when you get to those super intense and high contrast stars in the
right.
background, that really makes me think the artist did not know the art would be used this way. Because just as we've been bragging about how this, or giving kudos to this game for carefully thinking about these things in contrast and not distracting the player with information visually that's not important, this is the opposite, where you've got these bright moving things flying at the player that they're supposed to be way in the background. They have nothing to do with the gameplay. And these same artists could have done something beautiful, maybe even that had built-in motion blur, that did not have these super contrasty night sky star segments. And then you would have had the drama of the movement, and you would still know, oh, wow, the ship is flying in space, or in the air, but you wouldn't have that distracting and frankly quite gaudy effect.
Right,
It's just
right.
visually
Yeah, the ups and
unappealing. Yeah.
downs of the clouds too. It's a bit heavy.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
to me, if you are going to scroll something this fast in a game, you have to make it much simpler in terms of its level of contrast and shape,
Yeah,
and make sure
exactly.
that it's something that is still fairly pleasant on the eyes, no
Exactly.
matter what. But still, just giving you that sense of speed that you
Yeah.
need.
And
Uh,
I like the way you worded it with ups and downs. Like that's the whole thing
right.
again, where like that's another reason when you think about largely vertical versus largely horizontal designs. If you
Hmm.
want something to be not too distracting and have that sense of motion, the artist could have designed these cloud shapes to be more stretched out and horizontal, and maybe even added a built-in motion blur style effect to it. And then
Right.
it would have looked better and emphasized motion without the motion being jarring and distracting because of those bright, almost white stars that keep flying through. And like you said, you've got these kind of big hills or bumps of very vertical shape in the clouds with these strong highlights hitting them. And that just also makes it a lot more distracting than it needs to be. They could have had all of the drama and all of the sense of motion with none of the distraction, and it would have looked
Yep.
visually more pleasant.
And even the stars having a sort of streak
Yeah,
design to them, as opposed to just being the
exactly.
dots they are, would
Yeah,
would have gone a long way toward giving.
yeah,
They do that all the time in
yeah,
games and shows and things.
exactly.
That's pretty common. So yeah,
Right. Like I really,
it's
that's what I would have done. I'll bet you that's what these artists would have done if they knew this was going to be moving fast. Is that any one star would have been a dark blue pixel trailing to a super dark blue pixel uh, horizontally to make a built-in motion blur style effect. You know what
yep.
I mean? Like it would have been, one pixel of dark blue and then darker blue still to its right, one darker blue still. You know what I mean?
Right,
But
right.
yeah, it just would have. They could have kept the stars. It's just this is such a challenge. This big, super specifically designed, very vertical. It's just really loud. Let me get back into promotion here. And okay, so this is an actual screenshot from the game. And this is
Hmm.
going back to that idea of everything has its own 16 color set in this case. And so they had all the colors and color fidelity they needed, and they did a great job with all the stuff. But this, to me, feels like one of those cases where I have a feeling the artist animated this against a black background or
Hmm.
like a single colored background, and then maybe never had a chance to tweak it ever again once it was in game. Because when I saw these, when I actually tried playing the first level and a flock of these flew through, they're so dark and their contrast is so low. It just was kind of this amorphous cloud of darkness flying at me.
Right, yeah.
And so, like, I did a quick tweak. Here we go. So you could see I just altered the palette a little bit to make the brightest colors a little brighter, and then I added a little bit more of a rim lighting to this edge here. And it's not a massive difference, but it really does when you're doing a very dark, enemy or creature or whatever. You don't want it to look like almost nothing but a silhouette when it's actually coming at you in game, or
Yeah,
presumably you
and
don't.
also just the scene in general.
Yeah.
It's kind of firelit, very
Yeah.
warm
Exactly.
lighting, and
Exactly.
they don't have that. They look like they're
Right.
moonlit, sort of,
Right. Yeah. The
with some
original.
dim
Yeah.
lighting. And
Exactly.
yeah, again, that's probably just another one of those either miscommunications or the artist just didn't know. Like they were
Yeah.
told to make a crow,
Right.
and they didn't know where it was going to be.
Right. And
So
then, so yeah, and then like, look how bright the lighting is in contrast on the player universally in the game, and then almost everything is that way. If you look at him again, very
right,
bright
yeah.
contrast, and then the crow is beautifully done, but with much less, much more subdued lighting, almost as though it's a background object, but it's not a background object. It's something that's going to do damage if it hits you. So I think the happy medium would have been to just brighten up the lightest colors to really hit those highlights. Make it, I mean, a bird's beak tends to be pretty shiny, as does a
Yep.
bird's feathers. So it makes sense to give it that specularity and just really hit that rim lighting on it to just make it stand out more as not just a silhouette. But I mean, that's a super nitpicky thing. But again, it just gets back to that idea. It's really good for the ultimate total quality and visual quality of the game, which for video games, they correspond a lot. If a game
Hmm.
could be beautifully designed, but if the graphics don't look good and don't communicate well to the player, it could be an overall poor experience in a game
Yep.
that does not become popular. Whereas a fairly mundane game with great graphics, it's not going to be a cult classic, but it could still do well and could still be well appreciated, at least as a beautiful game that communicates well to the player. It could still be a pleasant experience.
Hmm.
So anyway, news. This news just in: Pixel Artist says graphics is very important for a game. The only other thing I had to say that's a criticism is I think this is the actual splash screen for the game, or at least the sort of, yeah, intro to the menu.
Hmm.
And its quality, its use of color, and its detailing and its boringness make me feel like this was either made later by different artists or was always meant to be placeholder and ended up not placeholder.
That's
Like,
possible. Yeah.
it's overall, it's so dull. The colors are so closer to primary. It almost looks like a Mega Drive version. You know what I mean? Like this palette,
Right.
there's not a lot of subtlety to the color. They're very closer to just like kind of plain greens, and especially that dark blue background feels very Mega Drive to me. And just if we go back to looking at the actual in-game graphics with the incredible sense of design and use of color and bright contrast, this is not the best foot forward.
Right. It doesn't, like, you see that it doesn't really embody the game. I mean, there's
Yeah.
some nice detail in that environment there as
Yeah.
far as the way it's rendered, but it's like that logo feels like it kind of has that red
Mm.
splatter type
Yeah,
effect,
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
almost like it's a horror
Right.
sort of design, and that doesn't really fit the game in a
Right.
way. Like it's yes, it's about a nightmare sort of scenario, but it doesn't.
I don't think there's a
That
single
looks very
splash of
mature compared
yeah.
to the game, right? You
Yeah.
know what I mean?
I don't think the game has a single splash of blood in it, come to think of it.
Exactly, exactly. It
It's like things
feels off
explode. You know
for
what I
sure.
mean? You're not slashing anything, you're not getting slashed, there's no dismemberment. I don't think there's a speck of blood in the game. And like you
Right.
said, this feels so much more Mega Drive to me in so many ways in its overall attitude. But then let's go back to that mundane. It was just a totem, a little thing, a wall that you
Hmm.
destroy. A very forgettable section of the game, conceptually and gameplay wise, that the artists made look just absolutely beautiful. And that one totem face has more just amazing sense of design than this entire thing, which,
Yep.
like you said, it's got nice details. It's not that it's poorly rendered at all, but everything's just sort of there. You've got a
And why
nicely
not have the
drawn, yeah,
characters in here? You know,
exactly,
like it's just missing everything that makes the game appealing.
yeah,
It's kind of just not got that.
right,
It's a simple scene, and
right,
you're kind of questioning like what were they thinking? You know.
yeah,
So yeah, it's possible, like you said, that this was made later, and maybe they didn't really take the time that they. You know,
yeah,
whoever made this wasn't incredibly passionate about it and was doing it very quickly, and you know,
right, yeah.
it's
Good.
possible.
I mean,
So,
literally, they could have recycled graphics directly from the game and made a much, much nicer looking splash screen. Aside from
mhm.
obviously needing the text of the logo itself. Oh, that is another thing. We did not show any of, unless we did it accidentally during the long play, but there are cinematic cutscenes as well. I thought I had one of them
Right.
saved.
I didn't take
Oh,
any
here it is. Okay,
screens of it.
here's one.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
just have
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. They're nicely done.
Yeah.
Decent enough. They're minimalistic. They don't use a lot of them in the game, but
Right, and that's for memory's sake because
yeah.
cartridges were extremely expensive to make, and the more memory, the larger the memory cartridge capacity, the faster the price goes up to produce each cartridge. That's why it's not a whole screen. There may have also, I don't think they ever had any text telling the story. I think it was only the image, but I could be wrong. I wasn't paying that close attention to that aspect. But anyway, that's one of the reasons it's only like a little strip. They don't
Hmm.
want to waste a lot of cartridge space on it. They want it there for atmosphere and to give you something to look at. If it, later on in the life of 16-bit consoles, they did actually start using compression methods to save cartridge memory space and fit more. So sometimes, even though there's not quote unquote loading time like there is with disc based games, they would still throw something up on the screen while it's decompressing the graphical and sound data and stuff for the upcoming level.
Any pixel artists out there that you want to look at a nice game, despite the minor criticisms we did have, it's very nice to study and look at. You can look at it for hours, and even just very little things you would think a lot of artists wouldn't pay much attention to. They
Yeah,
really cared about the designers of the in-game art really cared about every aspect of the visuals, and
yeah,
it's a shining example of that. So,
yeah. I definitely agree. And while you were talking, I noticed that this is a great example. You just saw that very green goblin. These are the same enemy sprite. There he was green skin, there blue skin,
hmm.
olive green skin. So that's another benefit when you're working with these compartmentalized 16 color sets. If you arrange those palettes, those 16 color sets in the same way, like skin tones use these 5 indexes and so on and so forth, then you can just switch which set of 16 colors the sprite is using and end
Right.
up being able to have that much more variety on screen without using additional memory because you already have those palettes on screen and you just say, hey, okay, now we're going to make this enemy sprite use this palette, and you get like what looks like a whole other character. And it's really
Right.
cool when the programmer and the game designer can synchronize those differences in color with differences in behavior. Maybe give the red-skinned goblin more hit points and maybe he can spit out fire or something like that. Those are great ways that they had to use back then to get a lot more variety in the game visually and gameplay wise with very little additional memory usage.
Yeah, agreed. It's all the old tricks, and some. The thing is if you want to make something legitimately retro,
Yeah.
you might have to use these. But
Mm.
if you want your game to seem or look more retro, even if it's not on an old system,
Right.
pay attention to all of these things because all of them will help it seem that way. This is an example, though, like you said, of it having a more modern style than something
Yeah.
that would have existed at the time. So,
Yeah.
yeah, even modern artists need to take a look at this game for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And it really is a shame that most people just have never heard of or seen this game before. Even
Yep.
people
Yep.
like ourselves that are very much into, retro games, not just as artists, pixel artists, but as just gamers who love retro games.
Yep.
And
Yep.
but anyway, I guess that is pretty much it, right, for this one. So
Yeah, I believe so.
all right. So thanks everyone very much for watching, and stay tuned for upcoming videos.
If you enjoy our content and want to keep up to date on our games, please leave a like and subscribe. Also, if you want to support our projects, consider becoming a patron. The link's in the description, and we'll see you soon.